Welcome to our Beyond 20 campaign, a celebration of One Joshua Group's 20 years of service excellence. This is a One Joshua Group production, providing access to information and experts to help improve quality of life and health outcomes.
So, George, I have to, first of all, thank you for accepting our invitation. Just to give you a little background about why we are doing this podcast series. We've been so fortunate to be able to enter our 20th year in business. And you've been with us along this journey for many of those 20 years. And we are grateful for that, and particularly what we've learned from you, and just to commend you on your dedication for something that is important to all of us. But I want to let our viewing audience know that we have joining us today in our 20th Beyond celebration here at One Joshua Group, one of our friends, Dr. George Perry. And Dr. Perry is professor and holds the Sims Foundation Distinguished University Chair in Neurobiology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And he is indeed one of the top distinguished Alzheimer's disease researchers. He has more than 1,000 publications, and he's one of the top 100 cited scientists in neuroscience and behavior. He's also one of the top 25 scientists in free radical research. Dr. Perry is very proud of his Azorian Portuguese heritage, and if you spend some time with him, he will tell you a lot more about that. But most of all, Dr. Perry is committed to the science and to the education and to the treatment of patients who have various stages of Alzheimer's, and also to their families. Of course, his research focuses primarily on Alzheimer's disease, and he's also working on ways of having more effective treatment. Dr. Perry, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me to talking about a topic which I've spent the last 40 plus years of my life focused on, and even more for the celebrating 20 years of success with the One Joshua Group.
Dr. Perry, thank you so very much, and we appreciate you being with us on this journey. This topic of Alzheimer's-related disease is very personal to me and to many of my friends who are working with their family members and their friends. So tell us about Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's-related diseases.
You know, if you look back in time, I've been studying Alzheimer's disease for 42 years. And if you look prior to that point, say 50 years ago, this was a disease that was not appreciated as even important, because it was first described by Dr. Alzheimer in 1906 of a middle-aged woman, in her 50s, who developed cognitive and behavioral issues. And she became the index case for Alzheimer's disease. And people that have an onset in their 50s are rare. It was only in the late 70s that people appreciated that Alzheimer's disease was a more common condition of the elderly, people over 65. And in fact, now we know it's a disease that increases after age 60, where it doubles in its occurrence every 5 years. So your chance of having it at 60 is fairly low, 70 moderate, 80 and 85 different groups are affected, so that 1/3 of people are affected, or some minority groups, such as African Americans, may even be 60% of the people affected if they live beyond the age of 85. So what was a rare condition now is appreciated as a common condition. The other question I'm asked always, and it's actually the hardest one to ask, but first I'll answer the simplest one. What's the difference between Alzheimer and dementia? Dementia is a loss of cognitive function, usually higher cognitive function, and it could happen any time in life. Could happen after a stroke, could happen after a concussion, there are many reasons. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. Among the elderly, 60 to 70% who lose cognitive function have dementia, have Alzheimer's disease. Beyond that, to know what Alzheimer's disease is, people are still working to understand all the subtypes. And it's not completely clear. In fact, I just wrote a guidance regarding diagnosis of the disease, in which I suggested the way people were diagnosing it, which detached the diagnosis away from people. There's a move it to the biology without the people. What's significant about Alzheimer's disease is not whether your body has plaques and tangles or changes in blood markers. What's significant is you lose function. You lose touch with your family, you lose touch with yourself. And that really has to be part of the diagnosis.
Dr. Perry, it's interesting because I would have actually thought it reversed, so I appreciate your clarification. I actually thought that dementia was a part of Alzheimer's disease versus the fact of Alzheimer's disease being a part of dementia. So that's very helpful for the general public to understand this. And, you can read this and you can Google it all you want, but you need to talk to George Perry and the scientists so that we get the real deal of understanding.
You're very kind.
You mentioned some of the disparities, if you would, in minority populations. What about gender? Is there a difference in prevalence in gender in Alzheimer's dementia?
Yes, it affects women more than men. Mm-hmm. And there's two reasons for that. One, women live longer, at least in the West. And the best way to have Alzheimer's disease is to live to advanced age. Women live usually 6 or 7 years longer than men across the board. And that would mean they'd have a doubling of risk just from that. And then the other one is, if you even adjust it for age, women are more prone to develop the disease. We don't understand why. It might be related to the differences in hormones that change during the aging process, but that's an area of research. We did some research on this topic and even clinical trials related to it, related to the hormone changes.
Well, so that's very helpful. So part of that, and you mentioned, at least touched on some of the genetic aspects. If women are more predisposed to the disease states, that minority populations may be more predisposed to these disease states. Age is relative, I think, regardless of gender or race. So can we definitively say that the diseases, dementia, Alzheimer's and related, are genetically based?
In one sense, you could say that if you believed everything was genetically based, because we have genes that determine us. When you get beyond that, it is really hard to understand. And in fact, that's a topic I debated. I was given a debate, not a topic of my choosing, to debate that genetics has not been informative for Alzheimer's disease at all. And I thought, wow, this is a debate where I'm surely going to lose. And I won. I debated that the genetics has not been informative at all. We've known the significant genes. I'm talking in terms of treatment, in terms of understanding the basic mechanisms of the disease. What genetics, so I'm talking more in the scientific, and then I'll back down in terms of how that impacts real people, is that we know several genes, but they haven't led to a therapeutic, they haven't led to diagnostic or anything else. And we've known them for 30 years. Okay. Then if you're going to say, well, can I know my risk of developing the disease? If you have members of your family who have early onset, like onset in the 40s, there's a good chance that you have a genetic determinant. And And if you have other family members, even more so. And most likely it would be any of three genes: presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and amyloid precursor protein. And if you have those mutations that are known, they're generally determinate. In other words, if you have the mutation, it's almost for sure you're going to develop the disease. Most families already know these exist in their family because they have an early onset. All the family members that would carry it would have lived to that point. When you have an onset that's in the 80s, which is what most people, when people tell me about their relative, I always ask how old they are. If they're in their 80s, it's really hard to know what it means. Mm-hmm. Now, beyond those rare, and those are rare mutations, less than 1% of the population, there's no accumulation of them with minorities, but they could run in families. Like the most famous family now is one in the country of Colombia that has hundreds of members. And all of them developed the disease in their 40s. The most common genetic factor is the ApoE genotype, E4. There's 3 possibilities, 2, 3, and 4. And if you have the 4, you're at much higher risk of developing the disease. If you have 1, everybody inherits genes from their mother and father. And if they inherit one of them from one of their parents, they have about a 3-fold higher risk of developing the disease. If they inherit both, they have 10 to 20 times higher risk. That doesn't mean for sure they will develop the disease, but it's a higher risk. And if you look at people that have Alzheimer's disease in the general population, 50 to 60% contain the E4 allele, as where in the general population, it's about 20%. So it's enriched. This is probably more common in some groups from Africa, but it depends where they came from in Africa. And I found out that slaves didn't all come, well, number one, not everybody came as slaves. So they came from different parts of Africa. And the ones that came as slaves didn't all come from West Africa. I went to a minority meeting and thought that, and they nearly killed me for saying that. So I survived. But why I'm mentioning about the African piece is that we did studies that suggested the E4 allele, which is one that puts people at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, is important in protection from malaria. Mm-hmm. And it's the ancestral gene also of humans. So that is, and our evolution as humans is predominantly within Africa. We went from Africa and spread all over the world. It's only a question of when we left, mm-hmm. right? Some people left, 30,000 years ago, and some left, last week. But while we were in Africa, people are still dying of malaria. So that's one piece. And if you look in New Guinea, which has a lot of malaria, it has much higher E4 allele. So that's an important genetic marker. And surprisingly, in several studies, it's been shown the E4 does not have much impact among Hispanics for unknown reason. And that's been shown in New York City, as well as California, as well as Texas. So it's heterogeneous with regard to Hispanics, because these different Hispanic groups are, genetically not that similar.
Mm. So we've talked about the genetic component, and I'll just ask this because it's what people ask. Otherwise, are there any environmental factors that contribute to Alzheimer's disease?
I'll mention the genetics. If you wanted to know your ApoE genotype, you would just go to some place like 23andMe or any of those other places, and you could know your risk. But I think it's important to understand what it means. It doesn't mean you're going to develop the disease. I do not know my genotype, and I have no desire to know, because I wouldn't know what to do about it. Environmental factors may play a lot in these differences between minority groups. But the one that's really striking that the journal I edited, Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, has played a role in promoting is the idea of air pollution. Not just any air pollution, but particularly air pollution that is particulate in nature, like the one that comes from diesel exhaust or others. But it doesn't have to be only from diesel exhaust. It's small carbon particles. They actually can enter the whole body through unknown mechanism, but possibly the lungs or the nose. They manage to get into the brain, they manage to get into organs, and they cause inflammatory responses. And it's been estimated that air pollution, particularly particulate air pollution, may play a critical role in 30% of Alzheimer's disease.
Wow.
There's also a new paper that I shouldn't talk about that because it's not my paper. Anyway, there are people, I would just say, that I've heard of that have looked around at primitive societies and have actually suggested that Alzheimer's disease may be in major cause may be modern lifestyle, both air pollution and other things like that.
So looking at some of these issues you mentioned, 30%, that rate, and then we look at public housing, where some of that public housing had been developed in major urban areas around interstates. Are those kinds of housing, transportation, are those some of the environmental concerns that we should begin to look at in those communities where those houses have been those housing developments have been situated?
Yeah, certainly that's what the 30% estimate was, an extreme estimate. I've talked with other people, but the person who made it was a very prominent person. Okay, so it wasn't just off, without a lot of thought. But I think you have to look at urban areas in general. So if you're looking at minorities living in inner cities, whether it's the housing development or living close to where a lot of trucks and other transportation things are. Yeah, because that's how, in fact, Dr. Finch of USC did his estimate, was looking at how close people live to transportation hubs to see if that affected things. I think there's a number of issues that affect why minorities, but this all needs to be explored, whether it's educational, whether it's stress-related, diet. The list is innumerable and really needs to be addressed. But certainly you can't underrate the issue of pollution. And how do you know that they don't have different types of plumbing that still has lead in it? Lead is a neurotoxin. So there's probably innumerable things. Hispanics also have the same issues. I don't know why they do not respond to the ApoE genotype in having even more Alzheimer's disease. Among African Americans, they do. So there's just a lot that needs to be understood. Yeah, the air pollution one is something that's kind of surprising, and yet it's not surprising when you understand that these particles actually entered the body.
So one of the questions I think that the public always wants to know, and you did touch on that, other than genotyping, are there other tests available that could help us better understand our risk for Alzheimer's?
Well, I think if you really want to know the risk, the genotyping is probably the best because you do it one time and you're done for life. Okay? So you don't have to continually test. If you were doing biomarkers, Quest is now marketing a biomarker, which is, to my understanding, is not FDA approved. But they're marketing it at a fairly high price. I do not think these type of tests, this or cerebrospinal fluid or amyloid imaging with PET, I don't really think that provides useful information for most people. unless there's a better therapeutic.
Mm.
And right now,
So,
the therapeutics that are available are very marginal at best.
so they must have given you my note cards, because my next question was related to treatments that are available for Alzheimer's patients. So tell us about some of the therapeutics that are current and some of those in the pipeline. And what's your thought about those?
I would say so far, they're not very inspiring. Okay. So there's the old ones, like Aricept would be an example. It's a cholinesterase inhibitor. And its advantage is that it doesn't have does not have life-threatening side effects. It does have side effects, gastrointestinal side effects that often lead to its discontinuance, sometimes behavioral issues that develop. But some patients benefit from it. The benefit's marginal. Then there's an NMDA-related reagent, which is probably even less effective, but again, isn't life-threatening if carefully administered. And those are the old classic things. And when patients ask me or family members ask me, I actually recommend that they take them because they're not expensive, they're not threat, and they might benefit. Might. Even the company claims only 1/3 of people benefit for 1 year. That's the best. Okay, then you have the new drugs that have been approved. I have very negative comments about them, and I've written a lot about it. Mainly because, number one, they do have life-threatening effects.
Mm-hmm.
People have died, and not died in a benign way. The usual path of Alzheimer's disease is the person, if they live to the end, will pass forward in a relatively gentle way. The person that died of this that I know of the most, because one of my colleagues did the autopsy, and she died in his hospital, so he knew from the neurologist and the husband that she died in tremendous pain and had to be restrained at 4 points and tremendously tranquilized because she died of massive cerebral hemorrhage and vascular changes. And all of the trials, these recent ones, these are the antibodies to amyloid trials. And they have been effective in removing amyloid, but the patients didn't get better. All it did, the only claim is it changes the slope of decline. Statistically borderline. So these tests, what's important to note, they have thousands of patients in it. So if you have 1,000 husbands or wives, you're in good shape because one of them would get better. It's not meaningful when you have an N of one. We only have one mother, one spouse in most societies in the United States. And what are the chances that's going to really make a difference in a given family member? So the benefit is small and the risk is not huge, but it's significant. And this bleeding, which is a few percent of people have died so far, but that's within a clinical trial. It's well controlled. When this is given to people in the community, they won't be at the best treatment centers in the world because they don't exist everywhere. And how will the people be followed up by MRI throughout the trials, etc.? So I think you can really think that more people will suffer from it.
So clinical trials, participation of minorities and others in clinical trials is always an important discussion. What is that like for, and I'm a minority, so I'm asking that question. What is it, are minorities participating in these Alzheimer's trials at a reasonable level of participation?
This is kind of a very good question, a very, very good question. The answer is that was the first criticism of the first one of these to move through approval. And that was accelerated approval.
Mm-hmm.
That's approval mechanism where they approve a drug even if it doesn't known to work for a disease that isn't curable. And they said there weren't enough minorities. And then the second one, lecanemab, they did have a sufficient number of minorities. And when it was presented, they're presenting it as if people are discriminating against minorities. And that could be the case, but I don't think that's the reason this ends up being the case. It is mainly because when you do clinical trials, you want people that have a pure disease. In other words, pure Alzheimer's disease without strokes, without major heart problems, without the purest case. Well, those are not common among any group, and they're less common among African Americans. African Americans tend to have more strokes than the white population. That's going to exclude them. And one of the things that is not addressed in these studies, and I've asked about these because I participated in some meetings, and I said, if you're just going to have upper middle class African Americans, that doesn't really address the real problem. It's a socioeconomic issue. And it would be useful to include poor whites and poor African Americans, which are the people you want to be able to take advantage of this drug.
Mm-hmm.
And they have comorbidities because they're not as healthy. Being poor anywhere in the world makes you prone to many conditions. Mm-hmm. And so I think that issue, the numbers are there in the most recent trials because they worked hard to get them. But I don't know what type of African Americans they had. By type, I mean socioeconomic issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my grandmother died in 1963, and of course it was hardening of the arteries then. So that was the diagnosis. It wasn't Alzheimer's, it was hardening of the arteries. And then I hear you talk about amyloid. So we are just, I guess it just all makes sense that now we've come to a more definitive and accurate definition of Alzheimer's. You laugh. Tell me about that.
Well, because the vascular component of Alzheimer's disease has been debated for a long time. And the reason this woman died is because of blood vessel attack. When some people that have, well, essentially everybody who has Alzheimer's disease has vascular involvement. Some people have tremendous vascular involvement, and they have a condition called congophilic angiopathy. And all it means is there's lots of amyloid in the vessels. And what happens is the muscle layer in major vessels is replaced by amyloid. And when that happens, the vessel has nothing holding it together. And now if you remove the amyloid with an antibody, what's going to happen? You're going to end up with cerebral hemorrhage. So I predicted that, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, a small note in Science magazine, that the likely result of all these trials would be cerebral hemorrhage. But it's much more. There's other things. So also there's a vascular insufficiency theory of Alzheimer's disease, that there isn't enough blood circulation. But that area is fruitful for further study and still unclear.
Well, Dr. Perry, this is, I guess, because I'm passionate about this and I sit and listen. It's just so much to know and so much to learn. And thank you for your instructional nature and your informational nature as over the years that we've known you. So the takeaway for this conversation for those who are sharing this experience with us, what would we tell the families, and even without having an Alzheimer's patient, what should I be concerned about in the world of Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, Kermit, all I talked about is pretty doom and gloom and not looking forward, because therapeutics are barely working and diagnostics are getting better, but what is it informed without therapeutic? All of that needs to be seen in another context. In the last decade, if not, let's say 10 to 15 years, there's been a revolution happening. And that is understanding that Alzheimer's disease, like many other age-related diseases, are chronic conditions, multifactorial, and buttress lifestyle. They're not determinate genetic diseases. And maybe for the people, that have the mutations like the presenilin 1, maybe it is. But even those patients didn't benefit from removing amyloid. Even those. So it isn't as simple as the amyloid story. But diet, exercise, stress reduction, all the things you do in life, having a reason to be alive, as you clearly do, Kermit, all of those things play a major role in reducing Alzheimer's disease. Estimates are between 50 to 90%. That doesn't mean getting it to zero. So if you point to somebody and say, wow, they did all those things and now they're demented, and next question is how old? Well, they're 95. Well, at 95, your probability is quite high. But the main thing is, and several people have written books about this in the last couple of years, about things you can do. And they're as simple as 4 things, or as complicated if you want to do all of them as 36. Is, again, diet, exercise, and we're not talking about strenuous exercise, but not just being a couch potato, walking a bit every day, having a reason to be alive, and stress reduction. And as you know, Kermit, one of the issues that minorities experience in early life is stress, related to uncertainties in their condition in life. And those changes in early life can be permanent. So do I have a remedy for any of this? No. But I do say those are something you can do. It doesn't mean you won't develop the disease, but you can lower your risk. After you develop the disease, and what really can make a huge difference is realizing they're still people. And, they're only reduced to something that's less than a person, at full cognition at the very end phase of the disease. They're still there. And there are people who've written ways to care for patients. And a lot of those ways of caring for patients actually reduce cost and are better for families. The patients don't need to be incarcerated into nursing homes. And another piece is, don't just accept a diagnosis and a prescription for Aricept. Older people have lots of other health problems that are quite pronounced. Depression increases your risk to developing Alzheimer's disease and is associated with Alzheimer's disease, as well as other behavioral. So I recommend getting the best diagnosis you can get, and not just, accepting they're demented and they're old. Well, they may be demented and they're old, but it's best to find out. Maybe they're eating cookies all day and they're B12 deficient. Mm-hmm. And that can happen. Is everybody B12 deficient? No, but a certain percentage are. And when they're B12, it's very hard to get the level up. It might take injections or other treatments, but they're not terribly expensive or involved. So really knowing that, and I would recommend seeing a psychiatrist or somebody that's more humanistic to really find out in dealing with the symptoms that the reason patients end out in nursing homes is not because of loss of cognition. You can still love and have an IQ of 50. The problem is that if you're, violent or wandering or any of these, it makes it very difficult for families to manage people. So really get some guidance, and their guidance from professionals that are sensitive to what needs to be done.
Well, Dr. Perry, I think we've heard these 4 important, better activities: diet, exercise, reducing stress. But the most important part about this discussion, I think, is that we should have a reason to be alive, and understanding that there is a reason to be alive. I shared with you earlier, my mother's 90 years old. She has dementia on some days. We say that because, you get what you get. And I'm reminded, I talked to her just yesterday, and she told me, she said, the sun is out today and it's just absolutely beautiful. And I'm just so glad that I'm alive. So we thank you for that encouragement. Alzheimer's is not always an encouraging discussion, but this has certainly been an encouraging discussion. We thank you for your commitment to Alzheimer's disease. And that we'll see you and talk to you later. We thank you so very much. We've been joined today by Dr. George Perry. Dr. Perry is one of the leading research scientists on Alzheimer's disease. He's at the University of Texas, San Antonio. George, it's been my pleasure to speak to you again. And thank you for helping us celebrate our Beyond 20. And for those of you also in our viewing audience, stay tuned for the balance of our podcast. As always, we say be kind, be compassionate. And now Dr. Perry has told us that there is a reason for us to be alive. Thank you very much. Talk to you soon, Dr. Perry.
Thank you very much. Great to work with you.
This edition of Beyond 20 is a Life Beat podcast sponsored by One Joshua Group, your strategic source of engagement to improve life through better health, education, and information. For more information, visit us at theonejoshuagroup.com or follow our work on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter using hashtag OneJGCollabs. One Joshua Group, building capacity, expanding resources, joining what you know with what we've learned.